So, I've been thinking about PokéBlocks. Like a lot! One of the kings of complicated Pokemon BS, the PokéBlock greatly impressed me while studying for my last video, and I don't necessarily mean that in a flattering way. This video is a follow-up to my last video about complicated things in the series, all stemming from a train of thought following that oh-so-classic quote regarding the Azure Flute. Again, not in a flattering way. As a ground rule, don't necessarily consider this to be a PokéBlock guide, as my goal here is to explain the absurd depths of the mechanic. We won't be going over, here's how to win contests, and here's a great single-player guide, even though, by virtue of the insane amount of explanation, you'd be able to write that guide. But maybe just lean a little more on the side of weird and obscure facts in video games, as opposed to, now you gotta pop out Pokemon Emerald and follow along. All clear? Sick. Let's get into absolutely everything about PokéBlocks. For the uninitiated, let's start with the basic purpose for PokéBlocks' existence: contest stats. Introduced in Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, contests are an alternate take on battles, based on showing off your moves rather than using them to defeat an opponent. Even if you've completely passed over the 3 sets of games where contests exist, chances are you're still vaguely aware of them. I've personally always wished I could see that alternate reality where contests really took off, and there was a separate, thriving metagame just for them. But, just as there were separate mechanics, they decided to make separate stats as well. HP, attack, defense, special attack, special defense, and speed are completely out, and in their place are cool, beauty, tough, smart, and cute. In-game they're known as conditions, but we'll mostly be calling these contest stats as they're more commonly known. What are the stats used for? Well, they aren't used in the same way battles are, where each stat largely controls how you interact with each kind of move. Instead, contests are simply split into 2 phases, and the first phase is where they check how much of a given stat you have. It's perhaps a little shallow in hindsight, I won't lie. There's a little more to it than that, but we'll dive into the specifics of that later. Now, rather than having these 2 separate stat groups tied together in any way, the 2 are completely separate. As such, something separate from base stats and EVs and IVs had to be created for contest stats. This is where PokéBlocks come in. As they are in-game, you collect berries, you play a minigame, and you get a PokéBlock that you can feed to your Pokemon that will raise their contest stats. Get a bunch of PokéBlocks, feed them to your Pokemon, and... oh. Not hungry anymore, huh? We're gonna have to dive deep with this one. Let's start with the absolute basics. Normally I'd start by talking about the completely unexplained numbers the game throws at you, but we have to back up. The entire reason any of this matters is for one simple reason: the Sheen meter. Everything about this meter is a goddamn mess. For starters, for some ungodly reason, despite being named after a term commonly used to describe animal fur, this is your Pokemon's hunger stat. This shows you how many Pokéblocks you can feed a given Pokemon, but you will surely only figure this out in hindsight when you've maxed it out and suddenly you can't feed the Pokemon anymore. The Sheen stat ranges from 0 to 255, simplified in-game as a 10-star ring around the Pokemon. When you've got 255 Sheen, they'll show 10 stars, and when you've got 0 Sheen, they'll show 1 star. So what you've actually got here is a 9-star gauge. So, rather than 10 stars that each correspond to about 25 points, you start with 1 star, and you get another one for every 29 points of Sheen, except 29 times 9 is 261, so you'll start with 1 star, get another star every 29 points until you reach 9 stars, and then you'll be 23 points away from maxing out. Simple and intuitive as always. Off to a great start, huh? Once Sheen is maxed out, that's it. That Pokemon can never eat another Pokéblock in that game, by any means. You know, starting with Emerald, they added the EV berries, which allows you to lower your EVs and retrain them, but no such mercy exists for the contest stats. Once you feed a POKéBLOCK, that's permanent. All this to say that, because we're limited by the number of POKéBLOCKs we can give a Pokemon, we're going to need to extract every bit of potential out of each POKéBLOCK we get. So, before we talk about the makeup of a POKéBLOCK, let's talk about how you make one in the first place. These are all important, and knowing this will have us ready for when we discuss the actual choices we want to make. Present within each contest hall are a selection of berry blenders, accessible once you've acquired the POKéBLOCK case from either the girl in Slateport's contest hall in Ruby and Sapphire, or the receptionist in Lily Cove's contest hall in Emerald. Berry blending can be done with friends or with NPCs, and in every case, each player must supply a berry of their own. Let's talk about blending with NPCs, because blending with other players is a little more straightforward, given that every choice there is simply made by a person with full control. Once a berry is selected, the other NPCs will select different berries. Remember this, they go out of their way to pick berries that are not the same as you or the others. Their choices are made such that they do not weaken the strongest flavor of the berry you pick. The flavors are listed on the berry's tag, but we'll get into that more later. They will only ever pick between the cherry, pecha, rost, aspear, and chesto berries. Then, you get to play a minigame. The blender will spin, and you have to press A when the pointer touches yours. If you're right on it, you get a double circle. If you're close, you get a single circle. And if you're completely off, you get an X. I'd love to say how close you have to be in terms of frames or pixels, but the machine has variable speeds, that's the point of course, and it's a circular machine anyway, so a pixel distance doesn't really make sense to measure. What I can tell you is that the game generally tries to accommodate for the speed of the machine, expecting you to press the button earlier and earlier as the machine gets faster. You want to press it such that you're done hitting A by the time the machine lines up with your pointer, rather than pressing it the moment the two pointers touch. Blending is biphasic, that is, it has two phases. Initially, every perfect hit will raise the machine's RPM, or revolutions per minute, by 21.09. Every normal hit raises it by 14.06. Once the machine hits 82.39 RPM, however, perfect hits only supply an extra 7.03 RPM, and normal hits do nothing at all. In both phases, an X will drop the RPM by 14.06. Additionally, the RPM will drop by 0.66 every second, and has a minimum of 7.03 RPM. To put it simply, perfect and normal hits raise the RPM initially, but once you hit 82.4, it's only perfect hits from there on. When blending with NPCs specifically, these values are divided by the number of participants. If you've got all three NPCs together for a 4-player blend, then these values are divided by 4. The NPCs all range from being average to being rather disappointing at the minigame. Shoutouts to Mr. Always bringing up the rear on the team.
You're Mr. That man missed 7 times! Wow, what is wrong with you?
At the end of the session, everyone is ranked based on how many perfect hits they got. Normal hits and misses are only used as tiebreakers. Then, the game makes a note of the highest RPM you hit during the session, and a POKéBLOCK is made. The last thing to note regarding NPC blending is the bonus edition from Pokemon Emerald, the Blend Master. The Blend Master is a special NPC who shows up based on the TV bulletins. We have to talk about those, don't we? Look, the POKéBLOCK rabbit hole goes deep, okay? We're gonna cover as much as I've learned. So, the chances of you getting a TV bulletin event are rolled every time you finish a battle. It should be noted that, while things such as the pickup ability only roll when you complete a battle, namely by way of defeating the opponent, just about any battle end will trigger this particular roll, even up to and including obscure cases like running out of balls in the Safari Zone. However, there are a number of very strange exceptions though, such as link battles not counting, battles in battle facilities not counting, and regular Safari Zone battles don't count unless you run out of balls. The specifics of this were only delved into recently, like within the year of me making this video, so I highly suggest Sir Toasty Toes' video on Emerald Secret Base decorations. He goes into much more depth there. For our purposes, just know that after every one of these battles, the game rolls a number between 0 and 65,535, our favorite number. And if it's lower than 655, the game will activate a televised event. Unfortunately, there are no random number shenanigans happening this time. It really is a pure sub 1% chance after each battle, and if it clears, the game tells you tomorrow. You have to wait a day to see if the check passed. If this check passes, the game then rolls for another random choice, this time picking between the 4 events: the Lily Cove Rooftop Sale, the Energy Guru Sale, Service Day at the Mauville Game Corner, and the Blend Master's appearance. Bear in mind that the Blend Master is new to Pokemon Emerald, so Ruby and Sapphire are only picking between the first 3. Since you've got a 1% chance to roll a TV event in the first place, and then a 1 in 4 chance to get the event that you want at all, it's about 1 in 400 chance that we get the Blend Master. So, if you're able to hit these obnoxious 1 in 400 odds, which honestly is not that bad, you should know after I talk about Mirage Island, you'll get the opportunity to blend with him. And right off the bat, he will pick between some of the best berries in the game to match you. His choices are between the Spellin Berry, Palm Tree Berry, Whatmail Berry, Durin Berry, and Baloo Berry. However, if you use one of these, he'll back off a little and instead pick between the Greppa, Tomato, Corn, Magost, Rabuda, and Nomel berries. But when the lid goes down, he's a machine, scoring perfect hits on every spin, rocketing the RPM of the machine to absurd heights. Blend with him, and you'll get some of the strongest PokéBlocks in the game, as evidenced by, I think it's finally time we talk about the makeup of a PokéBlock. Much like the bug catching contest, the game is perfectly content to let you go ahead and do as you please, only to then spit a number at you and call it an appraisal. We'll start with what these numbers mean, and then work our way backwards with what those meanings mean, and then finally, how the game calculates them and how you can impact them. When you make a PokéBlock, you're given a color, a level, and a feel. Everything in here is determined by the berries you put in, with the results of the Berry Blender minigame only having an impact on the level. That means that in order to break down any of these, we need to look at berry stats. Let's start with the feel. Berries have 6 stats. 5 of them are flavors, and the last is smoothness. Now, look here. Berry tags have a section on them labeled firm, denoting the berry's firmness, but this is completely irrelevant. Size and firmness are entirely flavor text, having nothing to do with any in-game mechanics. As such, the smoothness stat is entirely absent from all in-game descriptions, and there is no way to know what the smoothness of a berry is prior to making a PokéBlock without looking it up somewhere. And yet it's this stat alone that determines the feel of a PokéBlock. Feel is calculated as such. When berry blending, take the average of all the berry smoothness stats, then subtract 2, 3, or 4 depending on how many berries there were, aka how many players there were. There are no other rules here. This formula always holds true, despite the many technicalities and situations we're about to discuss. And what is feel? I've left this for last because feel is Sheen. They are absolutely one-to-one. When you feed a Pokemon a Pokéblock, you add the feel to their Sheen. This single stat determines how many Pokéblocks you're allowed to give a single Pokemon. As such, it might be said that our quote-unquote goal here is to minimize the feel so that we can feed our boys as many Pokéblocks as possible. In reality, though, the range of smoothness is so wide that it would be more accurate to say that our goal is actually to balance the feel stat such that every point of feel is as proportionately useful as possible. If there was a theoretical Pokéblock that maxed out all of our stats in a single go, it wouldn't matter if the feel was 300, we simply need to reach our goal before our Sheen maxes out. Our goal in this case being whatever we want, honestly. Anything from 255 in all 5 contest stats to just get smartness high enough to beat this one contest. So, berry smoothness basically directly corresponds to feel through means of averaging out multiple berries, and POKéBLOCK feel directly corresponds to Sheen. What we've essentially got is 3 different names for the exact same thing, none of which hint at this is how many you can eat. We're 2 for 2 on this simple and intuitive train. Let's get to the meat of it. How we actually raise our contest stats. For POKéBLOCKS, there are 2 remaining parameters, color and level. The issue is that, truth be told, these are both completely irrelevant. Color and level are really only indicators of the actual stats we want, that the game, quite frankly, chooses to obfuscate through the use of these 2. So let's just jump straight to said actual stats, and talk about how we determine color and level afterwards. Then, we'll talk about how these impact the Pokemon that consume them. The actual stat-raising portion of a Pokéblock is all contained within the flavors, which are determined through a 5-step mathematical process based on the berries used and the outcome of the berry blending minigame. The only way to describe this is with an example, as this formula turns into a numbery ramble real quick. So let's just take 4 random berries and walk it through step by step. Today, we've got 4 players, who have all together brought a Durin berry, a Starf berry, a Lychee berry, and a Palm Tree berry. Berry flavors are split into the category of flavor and the strength or intensity of said flavor. Durin has 40 bitter and 10 sour. Starf berry is 10 all. Lychee berry is 40 spicy, 40 sweet, and 10 sour, and the Palm Tree berry is 40 dry and 10 sweet. The first step is to, what else? Add them all together. Overall, we've got 50 spicy, 50 dry, 20 sweet, 30 sour, and 50 bitter. Next is an interesting step. Each flavor is weakened by another flavor. However, they are not diametrically opposed, but rather, each one is weakened by a different flavor in a sort of rock-paper-scissors circle. Spice is culled with dry, dry is undone with sweet, sweet is cut by bitter, sour is mitigated by spicy, and bitter is dulled with sour. Using these flavors' relationships, each one must be lowered by the other's value. The 50 spicy is dropped to 0 by the 50 dry, the 50 dry is dropped to 30 by the 20 sweet, the 20 sweet is dropped to -30 by the 50 bitter, the 30 sour is dropped to -20 by the 50 spicy, and the 50 bitter is dropped to 20 by the 30 sour. Next, count the number of negative flavors. This is then subtracted from all flavors. Now, anything below or equal to 0 must be set to 0. Lastly, these values are modified by the results of the berry blending. In the first run of my footage, we hit 93.82 RPM, so let's use that. This is used to form a multiplier, calculated as such. Divide by 333, then add 1. By adding 1, we assure that this value is always positive, multiplicatively speaking, so you can only ever gain flavor points in this step, not lose them. This also means that despite RPM literally meaning how fast and how powerful was your blender, it has absolutely nothing to do with the smoothness or the feel of your POKéBLOCKS. Again, intuitive! Now then, to make sure you get these values accurate to the game, some under-the-hood calculation here is that the multiplier is truncated at 2 decimal places. Let me say that again. Truncated. You do not round this value. Thus, my multiplier comes out to 1.28, and I'm sure you can guess what to do with that. Multiply the values by it. That's 35.84 dry and 23.04 bitter. For these values, you round them to whole numbers, so that's a POKéBLOCK with 36 dry and 23 bitter. As an added bonus, these berries would also resolve to a block with 59 feel. Now for those color and level parameters. First, the simple part. The highest value present is 36, so that becomes the level of the POKéBLOCK. As for the color, we've got another set of rules to delve into. First, we have to determine how many flavors are present. Just mathematically speaking, there can be up to 4 flavors in a single PokéBlock. If you've got all 4, this is a white PokéBlock, and no further information is considered. Similarly, if you've got 3 flavors, it's a gray PokéBlock. If you've only got 1 or 2 flavors, however, then we get to split into colors that actually convey information to the player. There are 10 colors which tell you what the strongest flavor in the block is, because the 5 flavors have 2 PokéBlock colors. One for when they're the sole flavor in the block, and one for when there's a second flavor. For spicy, it's a red PokéBlock if it's just spicy, and it changes to purple if there's a second flavor in there. Dry is blue and indigo. Sweet is pink and brown. Sour is yellow and olive. And bitter is green and light blue. If you get any of these colors, you know what the primary flavor of the PokéBlock is. Unless, of course, you made a really, really powerful PokéBlock. If any of the flavors exceed level 50, and they have to exceed 50, so it's got to be at least 51, then you've instead made a gold PokéBlock. Gold does not take priority over gray and white, so you've got to have just 1 or 2 flavors. Admittedly, I'm not a fan, because, well, look at this screen. The only way to glean at all what the stats of your PokéBlock are is by looking at the level and color. The block we made earlier would be a level 36 Indigo PokéBlock. At the very least, we'd know that it has 36 dry. But what if it was instead level 51? It'd be a gold PokéBlock, and there'd be no way to know whether it was mostly dry or bitter if you were going purely off of the information present in the game. Calling a PokéBlock gold seems like a reward, recognizing you for synergizing berries so well that you raise the block's stats well over 50, but it winds up punishing you by removing information. But while the gold block is an accidental punishment in my book, there is an actual punishment. There's one color we haven't discussed yet. When making a PokéBlock, you must not use 2 of the same berry. Do so, and you will create a black PokéBlock. I assume this is done to preserve the strategic aspect of PokéBlock making. If you could simply stack 4 of the same berry, there'd be no point in trying to cleverly marry together different berries with varying stats. Therefore, if you do use 2 of the same berry, the game will immediately punish you by throwing out the entire formula from earlier, and will just give 3 random flavors a strength of 2. Again, I can't help but wonder why they don't just prevent you from using the same berry instead of letting you waste your berries. There are vague hints in the game. An NPC that explains making PokéBlocks will say, everyone has to put in different berries, but I wish they were a little more direct. As per usual, the game leaves you with a lot of trial and error. Oh, but hey, even though the flavor formula is completely thrown out, don't worry, the feel stat is still calculated correctly. If you use 2 lychee berries, they'd resolve to a block with 78 feel, and damn near nothing else. Feed that to a Pokemon, and you've basically screwed them for life, as you just spent nearly a third of their Sheen on absolutely nothing. And there are no takebacks outside of the power button, and the old AB start select. So, I've been thinking about how do we actually get these stats into our Pokemon? You've likely pieced it together by now that the flavors correspond to the different contest stats, or you're just kinda coasting while I explain everything. It's the classic video essay experience. Because nothing can ever be simple, except for I suppose the PokéBlock hunger, which is still triple obfuscated with 3 separate names, none of which mean this will fill you up, there is still another step we must explain. I mentioned earlier that your usual stats are completely separate from the contest stats, but that's not actually true. There is one thread connecting them, and that's natures. Natures not only correspond to raised and lowered stats, but also liked and disliked flavors. If you're a casual Pokemon fan who only has a vague understanding of natures, it's like this. Natures place a direct modifier on your Pokemon's attack, defense, special defense, and speed stats. For each nature, one of those stats gets a 10% bonus, and another stat gets a 10% penalty. In games that indicate which is which, the red stat is the one being raised, and the blue stat is the one being lowered. These all correspond directly with flavor affinities. In order, Pokemon with attack boosting natures like Spicy Food, defense boosting natures like Sour Food, special attack is Dry, special defense is Bitter, and speed is Sweet. Conversely, if their nature decreases these stats, then the Pokemon will dislike the respective flavor. Also, remember there are 5 neutral natures that don't affect any stats. In these cases, the Pokemon won't have any flavor preferences either. At last, we can bring in the contest stats. If you eat a spicy Pokéblock, it will raise your coolness. Sour will raise your toughness, Dry will raise your beauty, Bitter will raise your smartness, and Sweet will raise your cuteness. Now for those flavor affinities. If a Pokéblock contains more of a Pokemon's liked flavor than its disliked flavor, you'll get the message that they happily ate the Pokéblock, and you'll get a 10% bonus on said flavor, rounded to the nearest integer. If there is more of the disliked flavor than the liked flavor, you'll get the message that the Pokemon ate it with disdain, and you'll get a 10% penalty on that flavor, also rounded. If the two flavors are equal, or if your Pokemon has no flavor preference, then the Pokemon will eat the block with no reaction, and gain no modifiers. In every case, once modifiers are applied, you can simply add those numbers directly to their corresponding stats. Let's take our theoretical block from earlier, and feed it to a Pokemon with a naughty nature. First, we'd take our 23 Bitter, 36 Dry, and 59 Feel, and check it against our flavor preferences. Naughty natures prefer spicy, and they dislike bitter. This has more bitter than spicy, so we have to give that bitter stat a 10% penalty. That's 20.7, rounded to 21. Thus, their smart stat raises by 21, their beauty stat raises by 36, and their Sheen raises by 59. One thing to keep in mind is that, because both contest stats and Sheen max out at 255, your goal should generally be to have your flavors outpace your Sheen, which is easily kept track of as they're 1-to-1. But let's actually talk about those goals for a second, huh? The absolute easiest goal to hit is 170 beauty. Where does this goal come from? Well, it's easy. That's when Feeboss evolves. Yes, we've gone this entire video without mentioning Feeboss until now. A Feeboss with 170 in beauty will evolve into Milotic next level, though it's quite an evil evolution requirement given that you can accidentally just lock Feeboss out from this entirely with a few bad Pokeblocks. That Sheen maxes out and you're just stuck forever. It's a relief that the Prism Scale came around in Gen 5, huh? Next is the goal of maxing out a single contest stat. If your goal is to win every contest, you may as well use different Pokemon, as it allows you to customize your moveset per Pokemon, and it lets you max out the stats very easily. Just get a nature that bumps up those values, and make blocks with a higher level than Feel. Even a level 20 block with 16 Feel is just as good as a level 30 block with 29 Feel. It's just gotta keep up with your Sheen stat, at least theoretically. It's here that I'd like to delve into what exactly contest stats do in contests. As previously mentioned, at the beginning of every contest, you're judged for your appearance and how well you look the part. It's basically a check of how high your stats are, without any regard to your gameplay in the second phase. Not exactly that deep, but it means that these are mandatory for securing a win. The exact breakdown, though, is a little more complex. Every contest has a primary condition and 2 secondary ones, as shown here. Scoring is split into 3 values. First, the value of your primary condition. If it's a cool contest, they'll take your full cool stat. Second, they take your secondary conditions. In the cool contest, it'd be your tough and beautiful stats, and they add them together and cut them in half. Then lastly, they take 50% of your Sheen stat. Add all that together, and you get your primary judging score. Really quickly, I'll also mention the sole held item for contests, the Scarves. Coming in 5 colors, the Scarves simply give you a 20-point bonus for the stat they correspond to, but they don't let you go above 255. Therefore, if it's a cool competition and you've got a maxed out cool stat, you're better off wearing the blue or yellow scarf so you can get some extra points there. If all 3 stats are maxed out though, then a scarf will be of no assistance. These scores can be estimated by the number of hearts in the crowd when the Pokemon is shown off. The cutoffs vary by the rank of the competition though, so those scores will simply be shown in this table. If you've got 255 in all 4 of the relevant stats, you'll hit a score of 638. None of the Master Rank opponents get more than 4 hearts in any of the categories, so if you can hit a score of 481, you'll outpace every opponent in the game. However, that requires maxing out your primary condition, maxing out your Sheen, and getting a combined total of 196 between the other two stats. But what if your goal isn't just to win all the contests? What if you need all those contests to be won by a single Pokemon? Maybe you're one of those crazy people who's gone for the elusive all ribbons on a single Pokemon. In that case, we gotta talk about the e-reader berries. Hey, look at that, I get to use this song again. And this time it's relevant. There exists a special group of 12 berries that were made exclusively for the e-reader and can only be acquired in Ruby and Sapphire. You cannot trade them, you cannot bring them to the GameCube games, and you can't even store them in Pokemon Box unless you have a Japanese copy. If you transfer any of them to Gen 4, they become Enigma berries. This is because, despite what you might assume, the e-reader is not unlocking the berries for you in your game, like say, how getting the Eon ticket works or any of the usual event items. No, the e-reader is adding data to your game. These berries do not exist until you scan the card. They work by simply overriding the Enigma berry that does exist in the game's code, but is never made available in-game. As such, think of the Enigma berry as a placeholder berry that the e-reader can then overwrite. All but one of these 12 berries would never appear again in the series, despite having full descriptions and designs and stats. These are the Pumpkin, Drash, Eggant, Strib, Chailan, Nutpea, Genema, Kuo, Yago, Toga, Niniku, and Topo berries. Of those, only the first 6 ever made it outside of Japan. For the record, it's the Chailan berry that would get a second chance come Gen 4, sporting a new design. Based on the Alkakenji plant, also known as the Chinese lantern, the fruits these plants produce have bright papery coverings that change over the winter, becoming a network of veins that reveal the orange berries within. Since this is a PokéBlock video and not a deep dive into literally everything ever, though it may as well be at this point, all that's worth noting is the new smoothness values that appear as a result of the e-reader berries. All berries in Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald have either 20, 25, 30, 40, 70, or 80 smoothness. The Genema berry slots in with all the other 70s, but all the other e-reader berries have new, unique values. The Strib, Chailan, Niniku, and Topo berries all have 85 smoothness, but their stats really don't justify the absurdly high cost. Pumpkin, Drash, Eggant, Yago, and Toga all have 65 smoothness, with fantastic 40 points in a single flavor stats that make for some pretty helpful additions to standard blocks. I should also mention that if you pick an e-reader berry or the Enigma berry when blending with NPCs, their usual considerations instead flip to trying not to weaken the weakest flavor of your berry. If there's a tie for weakest flavor, they just go down the list in order: spicy, dry, sweet, bitter, or sour. But simply put, we're not here for standard blocks, and sadly, standard blocks are completely irrelevant when we get to the absolute best strategy. Remember those black POKéBLOCKS? All they do is just assign 3 random flavors a strength of 2, making them completely worthless. But hold on, I myself said that the strength or the level of a POKéBLOCK didn't matter, simply that the strength outpaced the feel stat. Enter the Nutpea and Kuo berries, with a smoothness of 5. Blend 4 of these together, and you'll drop down to a feel of just 1, while the block itself still grants +6 overall. Now, rather than worrying about getting a single stat up, you've got the proportions to raise all of these. That's 6 points for every point of feel, with the potential to go into any stat. At 6 points per Sheen, you've got enough room to get 1,530 points before your Pokemon fills up. To max out all 5 contest stats, you only need 1275. That's more than enough, and given the incredibly small values we're working with, even the flavor preferences of the different natures don't have an impact. The Nutpea and Kuo berries even have 10 points in every flavor stat, so they immediately cancel themselves out by default, which means that using them to make black PokéBlocks is actually gaining them points. Bear in mind, however, that you're going to need a group of 4 in order to do this, though. A group of 3 people will get you a block with 2 feel, and even that's just too much. It's gotta be all 4 people, each one with a Nutpea or Kuo berry, and then you can finally get the one field block and max out all your stats. Well, there you have it. How to make Pokéblocks, how they're calculated, what they're for, how to min-max. I think we finally covered everything. Oh shit, the Safari Zone! Ruby and Sapphire brought back the Safari Zone after Gen 2 put it to the side, and I forget about this place all the time. Unlike Gen 1, it's not mandatory to go there for the plot, and even more damning, you're not even allowed in unless you have a POKéBLOCK case. Emerald's POKéBLOCK case is in Lily Cove City, so you're forced to backtrack if you want to visit the Safari Zone in that game. The Safari Zone and its mechanics have been completely revamped to revolve around POKéBLOCKS now. Let's just talk about the Gen 1 Safari Zone briefly, so we can get some perspective. I imagine when most of us think about the Safari Zone, we're thinking of the classic iteration that exists in Gen 1 and Fire Red and Leaf Green. You're given 30 special Safari Balls, in reality they're just Ultra Balls in Gen 1 and Great Balls everywhere else, and you approach wild Pokemon without using any Pokemon of your own. In theory, without battling, you two are meant to enter into a sort of zero-sum game. The wild Pokemon have a chance to flee, and you have a chance to catch them before they do this. You've got 3 options. Throw bait, which lowers their catch rate but makes them stick around longer. Throw a rock, which raises their catch rate but makes them want to run. And throw a ball, using your current odds to try and get them on the spot. For those of you who love mathematical deep dives, there's a wonderful article on the Cave of Dragonflies breaking down the mechanics. But this section is only a glance, so we can lead into Gen 3's redesign. So let's talk about that now. All Pokemon in the Safari Zone are now given a catch factor and an escape factor, not too unlike before. Throwing rocks and bait have now been completely replaced with 2 new options. Going near the Pokemon, which increases both their catch factor and their escape factor, and throwing POKéBLOCKS, which on its own only decreases their escape factor, but is also meant to supply the player with extra information. You see, bait has been replaced with POKéBLOCKS so that the entire system can revolve around natures now. Let's talk about the catch and escape factors, then we'll talk about the way POKéBLOCKS affect everything. The catch factor takes the Pokemon's species catch rate and multiplies it by 100 over 1275, rounded down. When you throw a Safari Ball, they make a new catch rate by multiplying this number by 1275 over 100, rounded down again. Normally, mathematically speaking, one might assume this would result in getting the same number in and out, but remember the rounding. This actually makes every Pokemon's catch rate a little lower than normally expected. For example, Rhyhorn has a catch rate of 120. Multiply that by 100 over 1275, and you get 9.412. Except now, you're actually just getting 9. This 9 is what's known as the catch factor. To now get your catch rate for when you throw a Safari Ball, multiply that 9 by 1275 over 100, and you get 114.75. Again, round that down to 114, and that's your new catch rate. That means Rhyhorn loses 6 points of catch rate just by virtue of being in the Safari Zone. The escape factor is just an integer that starts at 3 at the beginning of each battle. At the beginning of each turn, the game does 2 things. Multiply the escape factor by 5, and then generate a random number between 0 and 99. If the multiplied escape factor is higher than the random number, the Pokemon will run once their turn comes. As such, we can simplify this by saying that for each point of escape factor there's a 5% chance the Pokemon will flee. Since this is 3 at the beginning of each battle, all Safari Zone Pokemon will start with a 15% chance to run from the battle. The Go Near option, as mentioned, raises both of these values, and here's a breakdown of how it does so. The catch factor increase gets smaller for each time you've clicked Go Near, but it always increases the escape factor by 4, or 20%. Raising the catch factor gives significant increases, as with that Rhyhorn example from earlier. If the catch factor was raised from 9 to 13, Rhyhorn's catch rate would then become 165. Do it a second time, raising it to 16, and now the catch rate is 204. The problem, of course, is that you're giving yourself an extra 40% chance to fail. they'd be up to a 55% chance to flee every turn. But now, we can talk about PokéBlocks. Just like when using them on your trusted partners, everything is nature-based. However, now the tables are reversed. Rather than looking at the Pokemon's nature to decide what block to give, we look at their reaction to a given PokéBlock to determine their nature. The rules are the same as when feeding. A PokéBlock is enjoyed when the liked flavor is greater than the disliked flavor. They hate it if it's the other way around, and they're neutral if the flavors are equal. If they dislike the block, they will be completely disinterested in it, and the game will say that they ignored it. If they're neutral on it, they'll appear to be curious, and if they enjoy the block, they'll be enthralled. Whenever you throw a PokéBlock, the escape factor will be decreased. Like going near, the benefits are based on how many times you've thrown a PokéBlock, but this table comes with an added axis for their reaction to each block. An ignored block will never drop the escape factor, meaning its only effect will be to make all the other blocks you throw worse. Once a Pokemon's escape factor becomes 1, however, the game will completely stop checking PokéBlocks for an effect. Now, you might assume that that means once the escape factor drops below 1, the game will stop checking, so you can't go lower. Certainly that was the intention, but there's a little, we'll call it a programming oversight here. I'm shocked it's in the game, frankly. You see, many things in the series have this exact little appendage in their code. If the calculations would result in a number lower than 1, then make it equal to 1. It's how the damage formula works, it's how the catch rate formula works, it's all over the series to make 1 a minimum for a lot of things. But for this one specific thing, they set it so that if the escape factor is lower than 0, then set it to 1. This means that if you throw a Pokéblock that winds up setting the escape factor exactly to 0, then the game will gladly leave it at this number, and the Pokemon will never escape. In fact, here's something sneaky. Remember that all Pokemon start with an escape factor of 3. If the first block you throw gets the curious reaction, that will reduce the escape factor by 3. Now, they're at 0, and they will never run away, provided you never touch the go near or PokéBlock buttons again. Just remember that if you drop the factor below 0, the game will set it to 1, and will then ignore your PokéBlocks. Now, that would be the end of that, but there's one more thing in the Safari Zone that I've left out until now. The feeders. Throughout the park are these little feeders which you can place PokéBlocks in. Do so, and, for the next 100 steps, all Pokemon encountered within 5 steps of the feeder will be Pokemon with natures that prefer the flavor of the block placed. If you've got a block with only 1 flavor, you can narrow the list down to just the 4 natures that correspond to that flavor. If your block somehow doesn't have a nature that would prefer it, then the feeder will simply have no effect. There, of course, is a quirk in the way this is programmed, and it leads to a huge bias for natures with higher internal IDs. If you're curious, this is the internal list of natures in the game, with the IDs they correspond to, color-coded for the flavor they prefer, with all neutral natures left white. Bulbapedia breaks this bias down as such. If a green, bitter Pokéblock is in the feeder and forces an enthralling nature, Calm has an 8.71% chance to be forced, Gentle has a 15.61% chance to be forced, Sassy has a 27.66% chance to be forced, and Careful has a 48.02% chance to be forced. Approximately. But this is strange, right? To this day, I don't think they've ever explained natures in the main series. The closest has been HeartGold and SoulSilver adding the colored stats for the summary page, and then Sword and Shield adding the mints, neither of which actually say this is what natures do. Even if Sword and Shield has an adamant mint that raises attack and lowers special attack, there's still a weird gray area in which they don't say it's called that because this is what the adamant nature does. Given that this many years out they still haven't gotten really concrete, Ruby and Sapphire, the games that introduce natures, hella don't make any reference to what the hell natures are or what they do, yet they made sure to include a feature that would help you get Pokemon of the nature you wanted. From the perspective of a casual player who is not using the internet or strategy guide, first off, let me just apologize to this hypothetical person, dear God. Even if you intuit, putting a Pokéblock here will give me Pokemon that like this kind of Pokéblock, I can only imagine you'd use this for getting contest Pokemon, since you'd know what flavor blocks it likes. Now, considering this from the perspective of the developers, I can't even begin to guess. Maybe they knew deep down that players would be looking for a way to get specific natures, even though they were never going to explain any of it. After all, once Emerald rolled around, we'd get Synchronized and its wonderful out-of-battle effect where it can search for specific natures. Well, as a quick aside, I'll add some extra tips. Because the feeders force natures for the next 100 steps, you can use that to manipulate getting a curious PokéBlock on the first turn. If you instead get an ignored block on the first turn, you can then do one that'll get them enthralled on the second turn, having the same effect. This is also the best use for low-level single-flavor blocks. You can make red, yellow, blue, green, and pink PokéBlocks at the 3 NPC blenders with the Cherry, Aspir, Chesto, Rost, and Pecha berries respectively. And then, bring these to manipulate natures at the Safari Zone. And also remember that you can spin around in place to get endless encounters in the Safari Zone without wasting steps. With that, we may very well have covered everything. What else is there? Did you know that the little dance your Pokemon do as you wind up the POKéBLOCK case is based on their nature? All 25 natures in the game have their own animation. Feel free to rewind this segment 25 times to see them all. And, POKéBLOCKS are in Pokemon Pinball, Ruby, and Sapphire? You gotta get 3 blue ones to evolve Feebas into Milotic. Oh no. No. I never said I was doing ORAS. I specifically said absolutely everything about POKéBLOCKS. Okay, fine, get over here. You know what, you two. So, I can promise you right now that we are not talking about Poffins. This is a POKéBLOCK video, okay? But I do want to mention the berries in Gen 4, specifically the returning ones. Most of the berries' flavor stats have not been touched, but berries 31 through 40, which all had flavors of strength 40, have been dropped to 30. In return, though, their smoothness stats have been halved. Poffin feel is calculated largely the same as POKéBLOCK feel, part of the reason we're not really talking about Poffins, just everything is almost identical. But, as a result, having the feel of a berry is really significant. The Lansat and Starf berries, though, were raised from 30 to 50, but they now have actual flavor stats instead of being full neutral, so it's a worthy trade-off. All of this makes it actually plausible that you'd be able to raise the stats of your Pokemon without just filling up instantly. Outside of Lansat and Starf at 50, there are just 5 berries with a smoothness of 60, and this is the highest that it gets in the game. Consider that in Gen 3, those 10 berries I mentioned from 31 to 40 were all 70 and 80 smoothness, with an extra 4 e-reader berries hitting 85. With Gen 4's restructure, 89% of all the berries in the game are 40 or lower. It's a huge relief, as the fear of, oops, I just completely ruined my Pokemon by feeding them a block that was worth 1/4 of their lifetime allowance, is greatly mitigated. Why do I mention this? Because it leads up to the big conclusion here. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire completely removed the Sheen stat. Remember what I said earlier, the Sheen stat is the reason you learn any of this stuff. Without it, you can essentially do whatever you want. At this point, the only concern is really how much time it takes you, but it's so much more than that. To say POKéBLOCKS have been simplified is a grand understatement. Everything we've talked about today is completely overhauled, and there are now just 12 POKéBLOCKS. Not 12 colors, not 12 categories, just 12 separate blocks. While the outcome is still based on the berry that you put in, no matter what you use, you are simply going to create one of those 12 blocks. Let's talk about what they are. As mentioned, it's incredibly simple. You've got red, blue, pink, green, and yellow, which all work as such. They raise their corresponding stat, which are still the same ones, though smartness has been renamed to cleverness, by 8 points. However, for every 256 points that you have in your total contest stats, the effects of these blocks drop. At 256, they will then only raise each stat by 6 points. Once you hit 512 overall points, the blocks only give 4 points. At 768, they give 3, and at 1024, every subsequent Pokéblock of these types give 2 points. The sixth variant is the new Rainbow Pokéblock, which functions under the exact same rules, but it raises all of your contest stats at once. Those are the first 6 types of Pokéblocks, so now let's talk about the other 6. POKéBLOCKS Plus. They have the exact same colors and correspond to the exact same stats, but Plus blocks raise their corresponding stats by 16 points, and they are not affected by the thresholds mentioned earlier. As an added bonus, the affection system added in X and Y has an effect here. You know, Pokemon Ami, the thing that evolves Eevee into Sylveon. Once you hit 2 hearts of affection, every Pokéblock gets an extra point. At 4 hearts, each block gets 2 extra points, and at 5 hearts, it's 4 extra points. This is a flat rate applied to every block of every type and at every threshold. For Rainbow blocks, yes, this is extra points to every stat. Now, for how you make them. It's literally just a menu now. Pick up to 4 berries, and for each one you selected, you get a Pokéblock after a short scene. Every berry is given a color, which is shown on the menu, and whichever color was most prominent, that's what your blocks will be. If you put in 2 pink berries and a green, then first, you get 3 blocks because there were 3 berries, and then, since pink was most prominent, they're all pink. If there are multiple colors tied for most prominent, such as putting in 2 blues and 2 reds, or 1 red and 1 pink, the game will just pick one at random. However, if you use 4 berries that are all different colors, then you'll make rainbow Pokéblocks. Yes, it's literally that simple. There's nothing percentage based, there's no formula. If you put in 4 different colors, you get 4 rainbow blocks. When it comes to making POKéBLOCKS Plus, it's simply a chance that they'll be made based on the berries. Rarer berries have a better chance, and if I pull up Bulbapedia's table, you can see the chances. Except, you can't see the chances. Outside of Landsat and Starf, every berry is simply sorted into these more or less categories. If we scroll up, we'll even see that they're looking for the exact chances. But ORAS Pokéblocks are so simplified that no one's looking for these odds. Need I remind you all that this game is 9 years out, and still no one's done this? It's just a testament to how thoroughly overhauled the whole system is. Just think, back in the day you needed research and trial and error and skill to pop out the most efficient Pokéblocks possible, and now it's just a click 4 berries and feed your Pokemon menu. But is that really an issue? Can we really say they did the wrong thing here? Honestly, what was added by having such an incredibly complex system that's just never revealed to the player in any way? Between this video and the last, there's a part of me that feels the series has some missing potential with all these mechanics. Sometimes I wish they'd really invite players in, let them see all the numbers if they desire, and just fully commit to the complexities of the series. But even to this day, there's been such a slow tiptoe towards it. In the modern series, they've added things like Super Training, Hyper Training, Everstone and Destiny Knot breeding, searching for natures with Synchronize, EV training with power items, and I know all these things are related to competitive battling, but they're also all things that make some of the more complicated aspects of the series a little easier to deal with, but all of them have one huge thing in common. They circumvent the actual process of, well, telling anyone what any of the complex mechanics are. Imagine, they added a feature that lets you raise a Pokemon's IVs, but they won't tell us what an IV is. In many ways, POKéBLOCKS are a representation of the series as a whole. Deep, complicated, and never explained in any capacity. But hey, they make for a fun deep dive. But if you making it this far into the video is any indication, there's clearly a desire to learn about this sort of thing. So now I turn it over to you. What do you want to hear about? Are there any mechanics you'd like to dive into? One of my viewers suggested Pomegberry glitches in Emerald, and Well, let's just say that as I near the end of the script, the idea of jumping straight into that sounds like literally the worst thing I've ever heard. I'm sure it'll happen eventually. Just know that my next video could be literally anything. But the sky's the limit, and I'm glad you all are here for the ride.